On tonight's panel, Mel Stride, former businessman elected in 2010. He served under David Cameron and is now Financial Secretary to the Treasury. A solicitor for 25 years before becoming an MP, Labour's Shadow Secretary for Transport, Andy MacDonald. Elected as an MP in the Labour landslide of 1997, junior minister under Tony Blair and Ed Miliband, and since Monday, a member of the new independent group of MPs, Chris Leslie. Ella Whelan, commentator of the online website Spite and author of What Women Want, Fun, Freedom and an End to Feminism, and former Liverpool and England player and general footballing legend, John Barnes. Welcome to our panel, to our audience here and, of course, to you at home. Remember, you can argue along using hashtag BBCQT on Twitter and Facebook and on Instagram. Let's get our first question, please, from Emma Robinson.
My question is leaving a party to join an independent group with no by-election an insult to voters and to democracy?
Andy MacDonald, let's start with you.
Well, I have a lot of empathy with that question. I think what we've seen this week and with my own former colleagues is they've left a party that has given them the opportunity to enter Parliament, and also they went into an election in 2017 on the basis of a manifesto that was warmly received in many quarters, and now they've turned their back on it. And I think those people in those various constituencies are entitled to say to them, that's not what I voted for. I know the programme I voted for, I know the party I voted for, and I expected you to follow it through. Now, if you've changed your view and you now want to take a different line, then they're duty-bound, in my view, to go back to those people and say, this is now my offer that I'm making to you, and I would like you to support me in that. By-elections should take place. We hear an awful lot about trust in politics and politicians, and if we can't get people to do the very basics and just honour their own constituencies and their own constituents, we're in a pretty poor state. So I'd just say to Chris, you know, you've made your move, and I think it does fall to you to now go back to those constituents and say, look, I've got a new view on things, I want to persuade you. But to simply take them for granted that you can carry out through the rest of this term, I think is a real retrograde step on your part and on the part of your colleagues. And I would really encourage you, if you really care about our democracy, to do the right thing and go back to the people and say, here I am, I want a different programme. That's what you should be doing, but unfortunately, you've made it clear that you're not going to do that. And that's no good, Chris. You know,
but can I just point out, Tom Watson had said, whatever the merits of that position, calling for by-elections looks spiteful. That's from within your own party.
Well, I don't consider it spiteful at all.
Well, he does.
I think the spite is actually visited upon those people who returned increased majorities for those Labour MPs. Now, that's what they wanted. They wanted a Labour government. They didn't quite get that, but they do want to be represented by Labour MPs. The same applies in other seats as well, with Conservatives doing the self-same thing. The honest and decent thing to do is to go back to the public and say, you voted me in last time, I've changed my view, I put it back to you for you to vote.
Chris Leslie.
Andy, you know there were some real important reasons why I felt I had to leave the Labour Party. I've been in the Labour Party for over 3 decades, and it was not an easy decision to make. This is, you know, the Labour Party has been part of my life for that whole time. I actually don't believe my values have changed throughout that whole period. What has changed is the Labour Party, and it's the Labour Party that has moved away. It is no longer the Labour Party that most people think it is, and I think in your heart you know that is the reality. In our parliamentary democracy, the reason we have members of Parliament elected, on the ballot paper it has the name there, is because we have to use our individual judgment and yes, reach into our own integrity from time to time. Otherwise, you would just have a ballot paper which just listed the parties, and that would be that. And, you know, you'd pull a lever, no debate, no discussion. It isn't something that I have taken lightly at all. When you think about the reasons that I've done it, particularly in respect of what I regard as a false prospectus that was put by Labour at the general election, which on Brexit, where a lot of people did think that they were voting for a party that would stand up and defend the livelihoods and the jobs of those affected by Brexit, and to now find that the Labour Party is enabling the government Brexit.
But Chris,
that was for me a very, very important reason why I had to stand up for my constituents.
The question
and that's
is,
what I'm doing.
should you subject yourself to a by-election?
The dilemma I think we all have is that we're facing a big national crisis. Next week...
But what's the answer to the question?
No, I don't believe in a by-election because we have a crisis in our country. And if I just turned a blind eye and put my party whip or the tribe view ahead of my own judgment, I would not be acquitting myself, as I believe I have a duty to do, to my constituents. I want to, of course, as you know, have a public vote, as was promised in the Labour Party policy.
You want a public vote, but you don't want to vote on...
Let me finish. I heard your point, Andy. I believe that the Labour Party is betraying the country on the promise that it made, particularly in that September Labour Party.
Let me just hear from Emma Robinson again. What's your view?
I was just going to say, my question wasn't whether you have the right to withdraw, because you do have that right, but whether it is right to withdraw without a by-election and without following the democratic system. Sorry.
And what's your view?
My view, sorry. My view is the same as Andy's, that
there should be a by-election?
Absolutely, yeah.
The gentleman there.
There is a key phrase being utilised here today in the debate taking place by the panel, and it's called honouring democracy. You all talk about that, but the bottom line is, right now, the House of Commons is not doing that. Across the board, in all parties, you are failing to deliver the biggest historical democratic mandate ever issued in this country. You have a duty to dance to the tune that was given to you in 2016. Get on with it. We're sick and tired of Theresa May trotting over to Brussels with her own form of independence. We voted to leave and end and sever ties and being dictated to by the European Union. Get on with it.
Ellen.
I mean, I completely agree with you. And I think the real travesty to democracy in relation to this new group is that you're all virulently anti-Brexit. That is the real threat to democracy here. And it's fascinating because you guys talk about the fact that, you claim that the facts have changed on Brexit and so therefore there should be another vote on it or we should rethink it. Well, surely the facts have changed in relation to your standing as a politician. You are no longer part of the party that you were once. By your own logic, you should obviously stand yourself up for a by-election. It's quite obvious that you should.
Do you really think at this moment of crisis, what with 900 hours to go, before... I mean, we're not talking about theory
but you
here.
don't care about Brexit. But hang on, I'll just...
If I can finish my...
Well, before you do that, because I think you're being disingenuous to the question that Emma asked, because really it is a case of do you believe in democracy or not? And quite clearly the group that you're a part of, Anna Soubry, who wasn't here tonight and you're stepping in her place, has been openly anti-Brexit, openly contemptuous of Brexit voters. You yourself have been the same. And yet you want people to... You talk about caring about a crisis, the national crisis. What are you afraid of? Are you afraid that your constituents won't re-elect you because you're so hostile to democracy?
I'll tell you what I'm afraid of. I'm afraid that my constituents' livelihoods and jobs, the manufacturing sector, the service sector, all of those things are going to be potentially crippled if we go over that cliff edge in less than 900 days' time. And in all conscience, I could not stand by idly, like the Labour Party leadership unfortunately have been doing, putting party political calculations above what I passionately believe is the national interest. And I'm sure the big parties will try their best to punish us and to make us pay a heavy price. So be it. But I am prepared to put my
You're
whole
not.
history in the
What
Labour
does-
Party
but you're not.
at stake, and the voters, of course, will have their judgment at the general election. But right now, a general election, by-elections, frankly, is not the priority. Making sure we save our country from what is potentially one of the most dangerous moments in our peacetime history, that is the priority
Okay,
right
Well,
now.
Ella, just 1 minute.
What does, one very quick question.
You say that by-election is not the priority. We had so many questions on whether there should be a by-election. Let's just hear a little bit more from our audience. The man there in the glasses.
I think you've been disingenuous, and so have your colleagues, because you were voted on manifestos from both Labour and Conservative that said you would honour the vote and what the British people said. And you have, in various stages, particularly Miss Subra, I wish she was here tonight, OK, you've dithered, you've tried to delay, you're being disingenuous. You're only bound together by your dislike and your wish to push Brexit into the long grass and stop it. And why have you not been as passionate about the people's vote when it comes to your areas and your own constituencies? You've got double standards.
The woman at the back.
Actually, I totally agree with the gentleman over the Brexit. 75% of Conservative voters and 61% of Labour voters voted to leave the EU, and yet the majority
Constituencies,
of
I think you mean, rather than voters.
Pardon?
61%.
Sorry.
Yeah, 61% of constituencies.
Of Labour
Constituencies.
voters, well, constituencies, and yet the majority of MPs in the House of Parliament all want to remain. How can that be right? Surely these MPs who represent, well, it's regardless whether their constituents voted to remain, Brexit won, Leave won, so that's what the agenda should be. The agenda should be how to leave the EU, not whether we should have another vote to see if we still want to. It's ridiculous. We've had one vote. We need to get on with it.
Chris, you're coming in for a bit of a pasting. I think we're only about 10 or so minutes in.
Right.
Is there anyone here who, just out of interest, who supports the stand that Chris Leslie has taken? The woman there with the I can't quite see your pink top back there. Yes.
I do agree with your stance, because I feel that both Labour and Conservative have been hijacked by left-wing with Labour, right-wing with Conservatives, and they're effectively pandering to appease them. And both parties are becoming ideological sects, and they're going to be ever-decreasing support for them. And so I totally understand why Anna Soubry and yourself and your colleagues have separated out, because it's not just Brexit, it's the whole ideology of the party has changed since the election even.
And do you think they should stand
Yes, I think
for in a by-election?
I don't think, as you said before, I don't think a by-election would help at all in the current moment. But I think, I think you've done the right thing in leaving.
Mel Stride, Labour have talked, as Andy has tonight, in very strong terms about the need for by-elections. That's not something we're really hearing from the Conservatives as far as the three amigos, as they're styling
the
themselves.
three amigos, yeah. Well, I very much regret that they have left the Conservative Party, and I think they're wrong to have left the Conservative Party, because I don't believe in the reasons why they've decided to go, and I hope at some point they may even return. We are a broad church as a party. I think Brexit has taken all the limelight, and all the disagreements around Brexit within both the Conservative and Labour Party have been highlighted, and that has layered over the fact that there are lots of important one nation progressive conservative things that we are doing in government, which actually unites us across a broad church in Parliament. But as to the question as to whether there should be a by-election, I think that's down to each individual MP that is in that situation. So you elect them. Yes, they have a party label, they stand on a platform, but at the end of the day, you put your trust in them when you send them into Parliament. And I think the part of this discussion that perhaps has been...
Even when they're describing the Conservative Party as blue kip, as Sarah Wollaston has done.
I don't agree with that, and as I said earlier, I don't agree with the reasons why they've decided to move on. If you look at what the Conservative Party is actually doing in terms of its domestic policy, I'm responsible for tax. We've taken 4 million people of the lowest lowest earners out of tax altogether.
But presumably the reason you're
2010.
not so keen on this by-election idea is you don't want to reduce your working majority even further.
No, it's nothing to do that. But
is
what
it
the
really
point?
not?
No, it's not. And the point that I was going to make in defence of Chris here, and I think maybe what hasn't come out in this discussion, is, you know, let's not beat about the bush as to what's happened with those who have left the Labour Party. The Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn has veered off to the hard left. It has operated at the grassroots level to push and, in many cases, bully a number of sitting MPs whose ideology doesn't fit with the party leadership's ideas. And as a consequence, some people have found it absolutely intolerable to remain members of Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party.
But hang on just a minute, because the Conservative Party, you've got the European Research Group, the ERG, within your party, which is described by many within your own party as a party within the party. So surely you're in just as difficult a situation.
Well, the ERG does not represent the majority of Conservative members in Parliament. There are far more who are not in that group than are in it.
Anna Soubry seems to think they're controlling policy.
Well, when you have a minority government, a small group can exert a large amount of influence. And
is that what the ERG are doing in your view?
Well, various groups in the party various individuals are exerting influence, and they're more influential under the conditions of a minority government than they are if you have a very large majority. But the point I was going to make was what they would all unite on, ERG and non-ERG, is the fact that we're cutting taxes for the low paid. We brought in the national living wage.
Hang on, we're talking about whether or not there should be by-elections. Let's not get into a part of the broadcast here.
But this is all being overtaken by Brexit. There are some real important things.
Well, that's partly because we haven't got a deal yet. That's partly why it's all being overtaken by Brexit, isn't it?
But the question you were asking me about splits, and what I'm saying is that I think if you can get beyond Brexit for just a moment, and you look at things like, has the Conservative Party been taken over by the right? No, the Conservative Party in Parliament is united around a progressive political agenda that is about looking after the least fortunate in our society. And that message, unfortunately, is being crowded out by this perpetual discussion about Brexit.
Well, about 3 of your own MPs.
Hugely important, though that is, that we get a deal and that we do the right thing by a country, which is what we're working on.
John Barnes, we're talking about whether or not there should be by-elections.
I don't think this is the right time for by-elections because, of course, Brexit is the biggest issue at the moment. But I think Chris and his colleagues should be commended in taking a stand in what they believe, regardless of whether... And if it's a protest against Brexit, it's about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, no matter what it is. I think they should be commended because I think too many politicians are, through reasons of expediency, aren't really showing their true colours. And I think in an issue like this, as much as we're talking about going through with the will of the people, and why a lot of the experts, as you like, I know that, you know, a lot of people who voted Leave will talk about what do experts know, but if they feel it's not the right thing for the country, I think they should stand up and say so. Yes, they do have to carry it through, but it's a very, very, knowing the ramifications of actually leaving, it's something that the average person doesn't understand. And I think that the people who do understand should be... I'm an average person. I don't understand it. So I must be thick. I'm not saying that people voted Leave. Exactly. But when I say the average person doesn't understand, you think that the average person out of the 56 million understands the ramifications of leaving Europe from a financial and economic point of view. The average person understands that, you think?
I think it's very dangerous when you get into those kind of discussions, because what you're essentially saying is that the average voter is thick.
Me. Yes,
no,
like me. No. That's not true at all.
You can make that judgment on yourself, John. I don't believe that you are.
So 1 second. You think not understanding the ramifications from an economic point of view means that you're thick?
How could we not? We've been. This is, as the panellists have said, this has been discussed ad nauseum. Brexit has. I think that it's the best thing that's happened to British politics because it's thrown up so many questions. But the idea that the average voter doesn't understand it,
the experts don't understand it. Everybody says two different things.
Is where the kind of elitist, anti-democratic politics of your new party, so-called group, comes from. I mean, let's go back to your idea of your conscience. What does your conscience tell you about democracy and your belief in democracy? Let's cut to the chase here. No one's really sure what this new independent group believes in.
I'll tell you.
We know what they don't believe in, and that's Brexit and the will of the people.
No.
No, actually, Chris, can I just... Because on your statement and your 11 values, Brexit isn't mentioned, which... seemed rather curious, given the reason you're all saying that you're leaving.
Brexit has been mentioned, of course, when we've been talking about...
But not in your statement.
Because the values that we share, and of course it is basically those in the centre ground of British politics, have to make sure that they endure beyond Brexit into many other issues. For example, the question about tolerance and an ability to have grown-up discussions within a political party where, yes, sometimes you will have disagreements on these things. That has not been tolerated within the Labour Party because any divergence from the great leader's view is absolutely not allowed to happen.
That you stood on a manifesto, Chris.
You know that the
railways. You've distanced yourself from that, from a fairer taxation system to make our country a more equal and fairer society.
Hold on a minute.
And you stood on that platform, and you're now decrying it in the New Statesman article.
Listen, the big political parties of this country want to keep everything exactly as it is, because the cartel of these large parties are quite happy to say this is a Labour area, this is a Conservative area. These are Labour-owned votes. You know that what you've done is created a situation where Labour MPs they're dancing to the tune of a small minority of members.
You went to your constituency with a Labour manifesto.
A small number of members who do not represent the full constituents. I have to answer to, yes, Labour supporters, but Conservative supporters, Liberal supporters, people who don't support any political party. And of course, at that next general election, people will make their judgment. But they sent me after the referendum in 2017 with a mandate on Brexit, and I put in my manifesto at that time I would fight for the jobs and the well-being of my constituents. And you can threaten and do whatever you wish, but I will do my duty to my constituents, and that is my fundamental view.
I mean, can I just say what's interesting sitting here is that all your fires directed toward Chris Leslie are not actually to our government representative.
Well, I mean, Anna Soubry has said that she's proud of her support for the austerity programme. I mean, we were absolutely vehemently opposed to that. The fact that we've got the people coming together, they say they've got values and principles and values. I have no idea what they are.
Well, read it.
They're absolutely all over.
www.theindependent.group. It's there on our website.
And you've got Gavin Schucker saying he'd prop up a Tory government. Is that what he went into the 2017 election promising?
Do you want to get a word in edgeways, folks? Come on, let's hear another question. Ross Hutchinson.
Hi. Have the major political parties in this country moved too far from the hallowed centre ground?
Hallowed, eh? Mel Stride.
No, the Conservative Party most certainly has not, and I gave some examples earlier of that. We have taken 4 million of the lowest paid out of tax altogether. We are the party that brought in the national living wage, which is going up well above the rate of inflation.
Heidi Allen also says the Conservatives have deepened the suffering endured by the most vulnerable in society. What do you say to her?
Well, I fundamentally disagree with that. And as a Treasury Minister, helping to oversee the Treasury's management of the economy, I'm proud of the fact that we've been able to put a record amount of additional funding into our National Health Service, which is my party's #1 priority. There'll be over £80 billion over the next 5 years.
Yeah, but what this question is about, no, in fairness, that's not what this question is about.
Well,
the question is about how you moving
to the left or the right. And
exactly, and surely part of what this is about, correct me if I'm wrong, Ross, is about the ERG. And surely that is what is causing so many problems within your party.
Point, Fiona, which is that the ERG is primarily about Brexit. Okay, the clue's in the title. And there are differences in opinion across the Conservative Party in Parliament on Brexit, as there are in the Labour Party, as there is right across Parliament, in fact.
But who is it more important to you to keep on side?
Because the question...
The Heidi Allen, the Anna Soubry, and the third of MPs that Heidi Allen says are thinking about following on, or the ERG?
The question, though, was about where is the centre ground and which parties are occupying it,
but which is more important?
And that question is not all about Brexit. That is about the other things that I've been talking about that are not getting much airtime at the moment, because it has become all about Brexit. To be a progressive one-nation Conservative Party and doing the things that we're doing to look after the less well-off is what the Conservative Party is about. And that is something that the ERG and every member of the Conservative Parliamentary Party is united on. Now, Labour are completely different. Labour have veered off fundamentally to the left, which is why Chris is sitting here today. They have an economically illiterate economic policy, which would basically bankrupt this country and take us back to all the problems we had before 2010. And they're riddled with the kind of racism and anti-Semitism and things like that, which they're not getting a grip on. Now, Labour was a once great party. The Labour Party of Clement Attlee and Ernest
Okay, let's not go that far. We could be here all night. John Barnes.
I think that's about the values.
Well, any of the questions that have been asked today, people have then hijacked them to talk about whatever they wanted to talk about. So what is the actual question that you want me to answer?
Have the major political parties moved too far from the centre ground? That's what we're talking about.
Well, I think from the point of view of the Labour Party, very possibly, I think. Because if you look at a lot of the things that we mentioned, someone mentioned anti-Semitism, and I think we have to be very careful when we talk about anti-Semitism, because there's a difference between that and anti-Zionism, and I think it's getting mixed up. Because I think, you can criticise the state of Israel without being anti-Semitic. And I think that from the Labour Party's point of view, as much as Zionists may want to talk about it's one and the same, I don't think it is. It's a bit like saying all racism is the same, because it isn't. Because, for example, the Jews, in my opinion, while it is a religion, they aren't necessarily a separate race of people. So I think they get mixed up in that respect. But I just think that from the point of view of the average person, I think that the Labour Party probably is gone a little bit too far left, and from the Conservative point of view. So I agree with you that I think it's gone a little bit too far either side.
Well, you think both parties have gone too far?
Both parties have, yes.
The woman there in the glasses.
I think for you to sit there and say that the Tories are looking after the most vulnerable in society is absolutely appalling. In my job, I see people who are vulnerable, who are ill, who are being made iller because
what
of
is
the
your
PIP
job,
process.
out of interest?
So I'm an information and advocacy officer, and I work with people with multiple sclerosis, and they are people who are very, very unwell. The PIP process is making them even more unwell. It takes over a year to get to a tribunal, and then the decisions are usually overturned. In the meantime, they're left without their mobility cars, they can't travel. I mean, they're living in absolute poverty, and that is all because of austerity and the Tory government. So I find it appalling.
The common denominator in all the debates is the first-past-the-post electoral mechanism. Whether you're in Brexit, whether you're a Remainer, whether you're left or right, whether you've fragmented from the two duopoly parties, it's all about first-past-the-post. It's 130 years old and obsolete. Surely it's time for proportional representation, like they run in most of Europe.
The person with the hand up, just there, yes.
Yeah, I just think that the whole thing is political posturing, really. I mean, when the initial question was about the centre ground of politics, the more away from the centre ground that we really are with parties, the more ridiculousness we're going to get like this, like people forming other parties and moving away from the real issues at hand, like tackling mental health challenges. I know for a fact that our local CCGs are not funded well enough to be able to deliver the services that need to be delivered. Things like creative arts therapies to support psychological services where people are non-verbal. If you can't talk, you still have psychological challenges potentially, and you need to be able to have support for those things. So in terms of the NHS extra funding that's coming from the Conservative Minister, that is just absolute nonsense.
Andy MacDonald, in terms of the political parties moving too far from the centre ground, I mean, clearly what you're hearing from Chris's view anyway, and the others that defected with you, that's exactly what Labour has done.
Well, I don't accept that for one moment, and I hear what Mel says about somehow the Conservative Party occupying the centre ground, but I don't see where the centre ground is in the introduction of the bedroom tax, of this splurge and growth in food banks across our country where people are experiencing in-work poverty. I don't know where the centre ground is that. I don't see where the centre ground is in the universal credit system, making people wait 5 weeks before they can get any payment. Or the huge growth in zero-hours contracts since 2010. It's got out of control totally. And the awarding of mega contracts to companies who were completely bust, such as Carillion. And you do it all on the back of tax cuts for the very richest in our society and let ordinary people take the burden. And they're going to their hospitals and seeing A&E waiting times going up. Child poverty is increasing. You've even stopped measuring it because it's such an embarrassing figure. I mean, to think for 1 minute that the Conservative Party are looking after the majority of people in this country is one of the most shameful things I've heard in many, many a moon. And it's an absolutely outrageous position to suggest for a minute that people are feeling better off and they're better looked after. The vulnerable have borne the brunt of Tory animosity towards them, and they should bring their heads in shame.
There is no doubt, Andy, that the mess that your party left this country with in 2010, which we have been left to clear up
But
and
that
do
was
the way forward,
9 years ago.
has taken time and has had an effect. The level of absolute poverty in our country is at a historic low. There are 300,000 less children in absolute poverty than there were in 2010, and several hundred less children in workless households than there were in 2010. And the reason that we've made that progress is by getting the economy right and getting it growing and getting jobs going. We have more people employed in our country than at any time in our history. We have the lowest unemployment level since 1975. We have halved youth unemployment. There has never been a Labour government in history that has left office other than with unemployment higher than when it entered it. Our economics works. I'm not saying everything is perfect, but we are getting there and we're doing the right things to do that.
Ella.
I certainly have some questions for that, but Ross, to get back to your question about the centre ground, I think it's disingenuous to allow both Labour and Conservatives to suggest that they have these great ideologies, that they have these great principles. I mean, the centre ground is all that there is. It's fascinating that you want to start up a centrist party when it seems to me, as someone who would, you know, really kill for a solid, proper, well-thought-out left in this country, that it isn't there. I mean, we've had technocratic politics for years now. It's a problem that's permeated the entirety of Europe. The reason why we have...
What do you mean by that, technocratic politics?
Remember, you know, politicians talk about things like in relation to the economy, balancing the books. There's no big ideas anymore. I mean, the left used to stand for things like freedom of speech, for working class rights, and one of the biggest working class expressions of politics recently, Brexit, both the Labour Party and the Tories are denigrating. So you can't convince me that you have spread either to the left or the right. That would be doing you too much of a service. I think actually the fact is that you've come so close to the centre that you can't fit a cigarette paper between you. And that's why people want different politics.
Yeah, I think that there is a problem with those on the ideological extremes in Britain, and unfortunately it has been pulling the main parties further and further to those edges. It breaks my heart, it absolutely does, that the Labour Party has come to a position where, for example, it would prefer to believe Russia or another state hostile to our country rather than our own police and security forces. I feel that when you look at the state of anti-Semitism and intolerance within the Labour Party, those are absolutely a long way from the values that we had. But similarly, I absolutely oppose this Conservative government because of the poverty and prejudice, which I think we need antidote for in terms of an approach to spreading equal opportunities. Look, the centre ground, the mainstream people of this country, they believe in fair play, they believe in opportunity, but they also believe individuals do have responsibility for themselves. Of course they want a compassionate government, but taxpayers' money has to be looked after carefully as well. And we're going to try our best in our new independent group to do something fresh and to do something new. You may well like it, you may well not. But unless we try, nothing will ever change, and our politics is well and truly broken. We have to give it a go.
The man at the back in the blue top.
About 10 years ago, we lived in an absolute haven of centrist politics. We had Ed Miliband's neo-Blairism in opposition, and we had David Cameron, the compassionate One Nation Conservative. That's given him, again, we have a compassionate One Nationist as Prime Minister. However, when you look at the opposition benches, we have Marxists, Trotskyists, and not to be, contrived, but those are the facts. John MacDonald is a, self-admitted Marxist, and that is where the centre ground's been lost. It's on the opposition benches in the Labour Party, progressively. Yeah. It's not rubbish. He's a self-admitted Marxist, and he would implement, very extreme socialist economics.
That is a blue kip.
Hang on, who's calling out here? I can't see who's... where you're calling out. Is that you at the back? Yes. What were you saying?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, it's infinitely better to be moving to the left than it is to the right, because as a social community, we need to be thinking about the needs of the majority. And without a shadow of a doubt, that is not what the far right, or indeed the Conservatives, do. They look after their own, they look after the rich, and they are not thinking about the poor, or even the middle ground. As a teacher, there are teachers living in poverty. There are teachers who can't afford to buy their food. They can't afford to live in London. They can't even afford to live in some of the big cities. That's where we're at, and that's what we can't afford to keep doing.
Businesses are scared of Jeremy Corbyn being elected. They are leaving, not just because of Brexit, because they see red knocking on number 10. And that's because they would be taxed beyond God knows what. They would not be existing in this country as profitable firms. And there is no way that you can provide jobs and infrastructure without these firms and without the economics of, even a third-way politician like Tony Blair. But where Jeremy Corbyn stands is going to cripple business.
Andy, can I just put to you some of the points that have been raised in the audience? John, you mentioned this earlier, and of course, Chris, has been a key point made by a number of people who have defected with you about anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. I mean, do you think that that is a problem, given what you've been hearing this week?
Oh, look, it's clearly a problem in society, and in the Labour Party we've had these cases, and my former colleague Luciana Berger was subjected to some terrible abuse, and we've got to call that out for what it is. But I would just say to people that we are a proud anti-racist party, and there is no place for anti-Semitism in our party or anywhere else, and we are taking this head on.
So how has it come to this, Andy? I mean, do you listen to the comments made by Luciana, by Joan Ryan, and feel shame?
Yeah, I feel incredibly embarrassed and shamed by it, absolutely, that it should ever occur. But I want to just reassure people that it is being tackled head-on, and the incidents that we are talking about, there's a mood abroad that it's somehow paralysing, affecting the entire party. The people involved in this activity, it's representative of 0.1% of the membership of 500,000 people.
But it's driven some of your MPs out.
But, obviously people have been terribly, terribly upset, and quite rightly so. Right. And my heart goes out to people like Luciana, who's had to suffer that level of abuse. It's absolutely dreadful.
But you wouldn't. But you also to now face the bar.
Diane Abbott has also received a terrible amount of abuse, and I wish people would not do this. This is a dreadful thing to do. They think they can do it from the comfort of their own home on a mobile phone and just wreak all sorts of havoc, saying things that are just totally and utterly untrue.
For years now, Luciana, many other of my former Labour colleagues have been demanding action on this. We had a motion passed at the Parliamentary Labour Party a few weeks ago that had 11 questions that needed to be answered by the General Secretary. She did not answer those questions. They didn't even come to the Parliamentary Labour Party meeting to explain those. And here we are. If you believe what Luciana... hold on. If you believe and respect what Luciana has said, she's come to the conclusion, because of this intolerance within the Labour Party, she's had to leave. And your response to that is she should have a by-election.
Yeah, that's the point.
No.
Do you really think she should have to... Is that the response?
I think when people leave
the response,
a party,
Luciana?
Well, about leaving a party, if you want to stand for something else,
what should she do? Should she take that abuse then? Continue to take
Absolutely not, Chris. And for you to suggest that I would promote that is absolutely outrageous for you to suggest that.
Why hasn't the Labour Party acted on it then? Why hasn't the Labour Party acted on it?
Has acted on
it.
Hasn't. You know that since the Chakrabarti report, those recommendations have been implemented.
You mean Baroness Chakrabarti?
Well,
who was given a peerage after her independent report.
Oh dear me! Are you really trying to criticise her integrity over that report? That is just that's an outrageous slur. I would suggest you just recoil on that a little bit.
I don't believe that Shamima Chakrabarti's recommendations have been implemented. I do not believe that it is appropriate that an independent report then resulted in somebody joining the shadow cabinet in that way. I just don't think that was right.
I think that is an outrageous slur against a good colleague, but you seem to be in the business of that. You know that council has been appointed to the party. The staff have been doubled to deal with these issues. They're being dealt with much more quickly than they have been, Chris. Please, give credit where some credit is due. Look, this is a hugely difficult issue, and people are going to work to try to get through these issues and deal with people to say there's absolutely no place for that in any party, and certainly not in the Labour Party.
Let's hear from the audience, the man in the blue jacket.
John, with regard to racism, I recently heard you supporting comments made by Liam Neeson. I was just wondering whether you still stand by this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because...
So should we just remind people, these are comments by Liam Neeson when he was promoting his film, and he was talking about an incident of a friend of his who had apparently been raped. She said she was raped by someone who was black, and he said that it made him feel that he wanted revenge, and he went out and for a week or so,
so first of all,
he wanted to look for was hoping someone black, anyone black, would pick a fight with him, and that he would kill them.
So first of all, you have to listen to the context in terms of what he was and the nuanced conversation that took place. He was talking about the act of revenge. So let's get the idea of a race out of it just to begin with. He's talking about, his film is about revenge. He's talking about the act of revenge and how it can eat you up, how it's all-encompassing and how it's a terrible feeling. So he started talking about Northern Ireland. He started talking about the problems that they had when he was growing up in Ireland. He then veered away from that to talk about an incident of revenge that affected him. Now, as he said, it happened to have been a black person. So therefore, the feeling of revenge he felt was against any black person. Now, as he said, and I believe him, had it been a Lithuanian, had it been a Frenchman, it would have been against any Frenchman. It happened to be black. So, after 1 week, or how many other days of going around, he then felt horrified and ashamed of the way it actually made him feel. So then he sought help, and then he obviously... So, the whole idea that he's racist because he wanted to kill black people per se, and I'll tell you what he didn't mention, which is very important, is... If you look at an Irish friend of mine explained it to me, when you are been brought up in Northern Ireland, and we can see the problems that through Brexit, may or may not happen, and he's aware of that, when something happens to a member of your religion, if you're Catholic, then your vitriol, your hatred is to any Protestant, or any Catholic if it happens to a Protestant, not the particular one who actually implemented the hurt on that person. So that is why I'm talking about the feeling that he actually had is a feeling of revenge, and he had feelings of remorse. He had those feelings for 1 week. Now, why I have to give him credit is because as much as we all want to say we view people as equal, we don't, and we have to admit it, because we are influenced by our environment, and the environment he came from, albeit from a Catholic and Protestant point of view, is whoever the enemy is, we have to kill the enemy. The enemy at that particular time happened to be black, but it equally could have been English, and he would have wanted to kill any Englishman. So, but those holier than thou who says how terrible it is, it's a disgrace. What is the truth about the way we all feel about people of different races, different religions? We all discriminate. And we have to admit it. And not only do we admit it, why I'm happy to say that I discriminate unconsciously is because the environment I've been brought up in that shows me that, and it continues to show me that. You read the newspapers every day and you hear about Muslim terrorists and Nigerian gangs, and that gives you a negative impression, not just of terrorists and of con men or gangs, but also Nigerians and Muslims. And this is the influence that society has on us. So we can't help the way we've been brought up, and unless we are going to be able to have the conversation, rather than as soon as we mention anything say, you're racist, you discriminate, but we don't. But that's not the reality. Because if I was to ask you now, if you had a choice of who you had to live next to, between I don't know where you're from, between anybody, a Muslim and a white, you would have an opinion based on the way you've been brought up. But we won't admit it, because we're afraid of being called racist. So that is why I agree with you.
Now, before we move on, I should just tell you next week the question time comes from Catford in London, where we'll be joined by the author of We Don't Want to Talk About Kevin, Lionel Shriver, and the German-born comedian Henning Wehn. And then the following week, we're in Dudley with former Brexit Secretary Dominic Raab and the Shadow Attorney General Shami Chakrabarti, who, of course, we have been talking about just now. Let's move on. Ben Redding.
Is the Home Secretary playing political games with the life of Shamima Begum?
Shamima Begum, of course, the schoolgirl from Bethnal Green who went to Syria at the age of 15. She's now 19, she's just had her baby, and she wants to come back to the UK. Ella?
Absolutely. He is absolutely playing games, and quite dangerous games. I'm not sure I'm not the only one that was shocked by the decision to strip her of her citizenship, not because I have any sympathy for her, not because I think she deserves anything other than, you know, a hatred. I don't think it's too strong a word for the things that she believes in, the things that she seems to be unfazed by. But because citizenship is something that we hold dear, it's very important. It means a lot. And we've seen that the Home Office has played hard and fast with citizenship over the last year. We've had the Windrush scandal, we've had deportation flights to Jamaica. It seems like the Home Office thinks that it can pick and choose what is a good citizen and a bad citizen. Now, there's a very complex question, because she has chosen to join some organisation that considers Britain to be less than itself. Is a death cult, you know, it wants us all to end. That raises a question, but I think she is our responsibility. And morally, she is someone who is radicalised in this country. She was born and raised in this country. She is our issue. And to strip her of her citizenship is to suggest that we just wash our hands of it. It's not just morally wrong, it's also cowardly of the Home Secretary. He doesn't want to deal with this, and I think he's absolutely in the wrong.
Mel Stride, where's this going to end up? Because to begin with, Sajid Javid was saying, well, maybe she can go to Bangladesh, because she may have Bangladeshi citizenship. Bangladesh said, no, she hasn't, and she can't come here. What's going to happen to
Well, I
this?
think there are two questions.
Can I
hang on.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so just make a few important points here. One is, you know, is this a political game? Absolutely not. Home Secretaries have to take very serious and very considered decisions on these kind of matters. This is not one of those decisions that's just popped out of the blue. There are many decisions of this type, hundreds, in fact, of situations where Home Secretaries have felt it right and proper to take away citizenship. It's something that's been going on for many years, and there have been many hundreds of cases, of which this is but one, and every case is different, and it wouldn't be right for me to go into the ins and outs of a specific case in that sense, other than to say that what distinguishes us as a government and as a country from ISIS, one of the things that distinguishes is that we abide by the rule of law, and that's the way we operate, both domestic law and international law. Now, the Home Secretary will, at the point that he took the action to remove that UK citizenship, will have satisfied himself absolutely, based on thorough advice from lawyers and others, that he is both in line with international law, which means you cannot make somebody stateless as a consequence of removing their UK citizenship. And you also have to, he would have to satisfy himself that bringing her back or allowing her back would not be conducive to the public good. Now, on that final point, let's just have a look at the overarching facts of this particular case. This individual left the United Kingdom, went out to join with ISIS, a terror organisation that has, amongst other things, decapitated innocent people in ISIS, in Syria and Iraq, has caused all sorts of destruction.
We're all familiar with how bad Islamic State
here
is.
in the UK has been part of inciting violence that have led to deaths in our country, including in Manchester. And I think on that test, certainly, it is right that we don't have her back in our country.
You take a very different view, then.
Well, I do. I mean, anybody who saw the footage of this young woman couldn't help but be shocked by her total lack of true remorse and her lack of empathy with the very things that Mel's described. She clearly thought was cavalier in her approach to these dreadful events of bombings and beheadings. But I think at the end of the day, I'm interested in knowing what she knows. And she is a British citizen. And I think it'd be infinitely better if we extradited her and brought her to face justice in the United Kingdom, because she's got information to tell us. And for us to say that we regard international law with great care, I'm afraid if you put yourself in the shoes of Bangladesh and say you've got somebody who has got the ability to apply for British citizenship but is a Bangladeshi citizen, and we're going to give the problem to Britain, I think there'd be an outcry in this country if we did that. We've got to abide by international law, and to render somebody stateless and say here's a major problem and just put it out in the world, I think is the height of irresponsibility, and we should act as a responsible nation and bring her to justice. That's the critical issue here. She's been part of an illegal organisation and she should face the consequences.
Young woman then.
What scares me the most is that she thinks she can do a course to be de-radicalised, and that scares me a lot. That's just going to help her be de-radicalised.
The man there, shaking his head.
I think to say it's not for the conducive of the public good is wrong. You've got a massive opportunity to bring somebody back, and as Andy says, to learn how she was radicalised and what we can do to prevent it in the future.
John Barnes.
Yeah. Well, once again, there in my opinion, there are two questions here. As to the first one, is whether she should be allowed back. Now, we know through international law, and being British, we like to uphold international law. We can't leave someone stateless. So therefore, in terms of her coming back, yes, but I think she should face the appropriate punishment. And in terms of de-radicalisation, there have been people who have been de-radicalised, and as much as you're saying she thinks she can, but she can't, we don't know, because it has been successful.
But when you say face the appropriate punishment, you have to prove that she has done something wrong. And at the moment, she has gone out to Syria, she married a Dutch fighter who was fighting for IS. That in itself may not be enough.
But that's the second question.
To prosecute her.
The first question is whether she should be allowed back. And as international law says, in terms of her not being allowed to be stateless, then there is only one option. Now, after she comes back, as to whether, I don't know whether it's from a de-radicalisation point of view, as to whether there is a punishment, we don't know, but they're two separate issues. But the first issue has to be whether she should be allowed back in, and from the point of view of not being allowed to be stateless.
But if you accept that international law hasn't been broken, and I would be confident that that is the situation, because the Home Secretary will have taken a very careful and considered judgment of this, would you then say that actually she should still come back?
If international law has not been breached,
yes.
Well, whose problem should she become?
Where does she go then?
Well, on the basis that she is not stateless, which is my understanding. At the point that the action was taken, she was not.
So if she's not stateless, who does she be? Where's she a citizen?
The Home Secretary who takes that judgment will have taken that into account. This is the point.
But also, this is not just a technical question. This is not simply a legalistic one or a matter of who is within the law. It's a deeply moral one, which part of it is also. Shamima Begum is one of the grossest things about her is that she's lapping up the attention like a horrible, nihilistic, overgrown teenager. It's really disgusting to watch the way she's enjoying this. But actually, on the other hand, it's really not about her anymore. It's actually about us as a supposedly tolerant society that believes in rehabilitation. That's the quite important thing. Even if you think it's quite possible that she will never be de-radicalised because she's such a horrible little witch that you think maybe it will never happen. But you have to have that belief in rehabilitation. And so the moral question is we are morally obligated to bring her back. Whether or not she gives us any information, I think, that... Quite perhaps that she won't. She doesn't seem to be giving any leeway in that. She's not fazed by what she's seen. She's not remorseful. The question is, we in the West, Britain is being asked a big question. What are your values? Do you believe in it? Do you believe in the morals of rehabilitation? Are we going to answer no and leave her out there, or are we going to answer yes and bring her back and serve justice?
Yeah, I think there are moral issues here, and it does come, for me, down to obligations and responsibilities. I think we do have responsibilities to uphold international law. I personally, from what I've heard of the particular case, do think that she should be brought back and prosecuted if necessary for any crimes that have been fulfilled. But those obligations, I think, are also to the country as well. I feel very heavily an obligation to the families of those who've been killed by ISIS and in terrorist attacks. And so I do think that if we are able to learn anything about the root causes of the radicalisation and some of those causes of this awful, terrible situation, how somebody could go and do that, we have to do it. We also have an obligation because there's a baby involved in this particular case. So this is a really difficult moral conundrum. But I think if we keep focused on what are our obligations, what are our responsibilities, we can find a consensus way through on this.
Woman then.
I think if we're a civilised society, we have to accept our failures as a society as well as our successes. She's a product of our society. By bringing her back, perhaps in the future we can prevent other 15-year-olds being radicalised.
With regards to obligations, has she not got any obligations? She went out there with a group that wreak havoc on our streets. And whether you like it or not, she helped or supported them. Now, if we allow her back, what does that tell other future terrorists? You can wander out there, come back and create havoc here, and it'll be fine. We're very tolerant. Tolerant or stupid.
The man there in the glasses.
All I would say is that she seems to be, as it's been pointed out, she doesn't seem to be remorseful or sorry. You don't see any teary, I'm really sorry, and look,
I mean, she may be brainwashed, of course.
But she seems to be carrying a can for a lot of the troubles and they bring and mischief. I don't know, it doesn't pull on my heartstrings slightly, but you do feel you've got to do the right thing. With the baby involved in as well, it makes it even worse, the decision whether to leave or do you bring her back.
I tend to think, actually, it's very difficult for us watching occasional interviews here or there. We don't know what's going on in the background. I would personally trust our security professionals, the police and the security services, to make a judgment. But there's absolutely no question. Of course, if she is, unfortunately, by the looks of it, still espousing absolutely abhorrent views, of course she has an obligation to take responsibility for those and not sort of in any way waltz back into the country and think everything is fine. Face prosecution if necessary. Absolutely, that has to be where this case is taken.
Can I just come in?
Very briefly.
Very quickly say that Chris has made a very important point that I was trying to make earlier, which is that the Home Secretary has to take this decision in a very considered manner. There will be all sorts of information.
You've said that already.
There will be all sorts of information, including security information, that he is privy to, and we may never be privy to. And I think we have to trust his judgment.
Let's just take one more thought from the audience. The man in the front there.
I don't think she's a product, excuse me, I don't think she's a product of society. I think she's a product of religion.
No, at the back.
No. Yeah, I would love to see the legal advice the Home Secretary has actually been given, because of what I think we're seeing here is the Home Secretary abdicating responsibility to take this decision. It's going to be kicked to the appeals court, which will probably cost about $1 million in taxpayer money, and eventually she'll be allowed back because it will be the courts that decide it, and the government can abdicate responsibility.
But you're prepared. You're prepared, though, with respect, to take a judgment based on some interviews on television and a few other bits and pieces. The Home Secretary is the one who has the overall picture. And at the end of the day, somebody has to take that decision based on what often is highly sensitive information.
And I'm afraid I have to take a decision now. Our hour is up. I'm so sorry. We could talk about this for quite some time, I can see, but our time is up. Next week, we are in Catford in South London, and the week after that, we're in Dudley. Call 0330 123 9988 if you'd like to be in the audience. It's all pretty lively here, as you can see, or go to the Question Time website and you can follow the instructions there. And of course, if you want to have your say on tonight's topics, you can join Adrian, Charles and guests on Question Time Extra Time, and that is on 5 Live.